The whisper that changed everything. Officer Jack Reynolds adjusted his rearview mirror as he navigated the quiet streets of Ridgewood on a humid summer evening. The patrol car hummed softly beneath him, its headlights sweeping across familiar corners. Jack had spent years driving these roads, their potholes and cracked sidewalks etched into his memory. Yet tonight felt different. He couldn't quite place it, but an uneasy tension settled in his chest. The fading sun cast an orange glow across the aging neighborhood. Most of the houses were run down, their once pristine paint now peeling like bark from trees. Jack slowed his car as he passed an old playground, its rusted swings creaking gently in the breeze. He sighed, remembering the neighborhood kids who used to fill the area with laughter, long before economic hardship turned the community into a shadow of itself. He was about to call it a night when something caught his attention, a pair of small figures huddled on the curb under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. Jack squinted and slowed the car, pulling over. His boots crunched against gravel as he stepped out, flashlight in hand. The beam illuminated two children, twins, no older than 10, sitting with their arms wrapped around each other. Their clothes were filthy, torn in places, and their faces streaked with dirt and dried tears. Jack knelt at a cautious distance, careful not to startle them. "Hey there," he said softly, lowering the flashlight so the light wouldn't blind them. "Are you two okay? Lost, maybe?" The boy shifted slightly, moving protectively in front of the girl. His shoulders trembled, but his gaze held a spark of defiance. The girl, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on Jack, clung tightly to her brother's arm. The tension between them was palpable, their fear so raw that it sent a shiver down Jack's spine. Jack waited, his heart heavy as silence stretched between them. Finally, the girl whispered a single word: "Help." The sound was barely audible, but carried the weight of something far greater than simple fear. Jack's instincts sharpened instantly. Years on the force had taught him to read situations, and this was no ordinary distress. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "What happened? Can you tell me?" The boy's voice cracked as he muttered, "We can't go back." Jack felt his stomach churn. The girl tightened her grip on her brother, her knuckles white as she whispered an address. Jack repeated it into his radio, his tone clipped and professional despite the surge of anger and concern he felt bubbling inside. When dispatch confirmed the address had a history of domestic disturbance calls, Jack knew this wasn't a coincidence. "Okay," Jack said gently, keeping his movements slow as he gestured toward his patrol car. "Let's get you somewhere safe first, and then we'll figure this out." The twins hesitated, exchanging a glance that spoke volumes. Whatever had happened, they weren't just frightened. They were traumatized. Eventually, they allowed Jack to guide them into the back seat of his car. The drive to their given address was silent, except for the occasional muffled sobs from the boy and the girl's whispered reassurances. When Jack arrived at the house, his headlights illuminated a dilapidated front porch. A man stumbled out the front door as Jack approached, his gait unsteady and a beer bottle dangling from his hand. He glared at Jack with bloodshot eyes, his expression quickly turning hostile. "Who the hell are you?" The man slurred, swaying slightly as he spoke. Jack's gaze flicked to the shotgun, leaning against the doorframe behind the man. His pulse quickened, but his voice remained calm. "Sir, I need to ask you some questions. Are these your children?" The man snarled, taking a step forward. "They're mine." "What of it?" "Get off my property." "Sir, I'm here to ensure their safety," Jack replied, keeping his voice firm but neutral. "Step back and keep your hands where I can see them." The man's hand twitched toward the shotgun. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup at 1247 Oak Street. Possible armed suspect." Before Jack could finish, the man lunged for the weapon. Jack drew his own gun in a heartbeat, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. "Stop. Hands where I can see them." The twins screamed from the back seat of the patrol car, their cries piercing the heavy silence. Jack's attention flicked to them for just a moment, enough for the man to grab the shotgun. Jack shouted into his radio again, this time more urgently. Code 3. Lock down the street now. The man aimed the weapon at Jack, but the sound of approaching sirens caused him to falter. Within seconds, the street was flooded with red and blue lights as backup arrived. Officers swarmed the property, their weapons drawn, and quickly subdued the man. Jack holstered his gun, his heart pounding as he turned back to the patrol car. The twins were huddled together, their faces pressed against the glass, watching the chaos unfold. Jack opened the door, kneeling beside them. "You're safe now," he said, his voice softer than before. "I promise." The girl stared at him, her eyes filled with both relief and lingering fear. "Promise," she whispered. Jack nodded. "I promise." As officers dragged the man away, cursing and shouting obscenities, Jack felt a sense of grim satisfaction. But as he looked back at the frightened children in his patrol car, he knew this was only the beginning. Shadows beneath the surface. The glow of the police station's fluorescent lights illuminated the room as Jack led the twins through the double doors. Marcus clung tightly to Mia, his small hands gripping her arm like a lifeline. Mia, in turn, walked with a defensive posture, her shoulders hunched, her gaze darting around the space as though every corner hid a new threat. Jack recognized the telltale signs of children who had seen too much too young. The station buzzed with activity. Phones rang incessantly, and officers moved briskly between desks cluttered with paperwork and empty coffee cups. It was a typical evening, but Jack's attention was entirely fixed on the children at his side. He guided them into a small interview room with a rectangular table and 4 mismatched chairs. A water cooler hummed quietly in the corner. The overhead light cast a harsh glow, making the bruises on Mia's arms and the tear streaks on Marcus's face even more pronounced. "Have a seat," Jack said gently, gesturing toward the chairs. Mia hesitated, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. Marcus sat first, his knees pulled up to his chest. After a moment, Mia slid into the chair beside him, her movements deliberate and guarded. Jack remained standing, leaning against the doorframe as he observed them. "Are you too hungry? Thirsty?" Jack offered. "I can grab you something." Marcus shook his head silently, but Mia's gaze bore into Jack's, a mixture of fear and distrust. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice sharper than her fragile frame suggested. Jack chose his words carefully. "Right now, my job is to make sure you're safe. Nothing else matters." The girl's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Jack sat down across from them, lowering himself to their eye level. He placed his notepad on the table but didn't pick up his pen. "I'm here to listen," he began softly. "I know things have been hard. You don't have to tell me everything, but anything you can share will help me understand what's been going on." For a moment, neither child spoke. The silence stretched so long that Jack thought they might refuse to talk altogether. Then Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper, said, "He yells all the time, throws stuff. Sometimes he hits." Jack's chest tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Your stepdad?" Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "And Mom just lets him." Mia's head snapped toward her brother, her dark eyes flashing. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't say anything." "Mia," Jack interjected gently, "you're not in trouble. You're safe here. Nobody can hurt you." She turned her glare on him, her small fists clenching on the tabletop. "That's what everyone says. But then they send us back." Jack's stomach dropped. He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but kind. "Not this time. I'm not sending you back to that house. I promise." "You can't promise that," Maya shot back. Her voice trembled, but her defiance didn't waver. "They always make us go back. Always." Before Jack could respond, the door opened and Carla Jenkins, his partner, stepped inside. She was tall and imposing, with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She glanced at Jack, then at the twins. "Harding," she said, "we need to talk." Jack nodded, rising reluctantly. "I'll be back," he assured the children before stepping into the hallway with Carla. "They're scared out of their minds," Jack said before Carla could speak. "We can't just push this through the system like any other case." "I agree," Carla replied, crossing her arms. "But there's a complication." Jack frowned. "What kind of complication?" Carla pulled out a thin manila folder and handed it to him. "The mother, she's already contacted Child Services, claiming this is a misunderstanding. She's demanding the kids be returned to her." Jack's grip on the folder tightened. "A misunderstanding?" They were terrified. "They have bruises. She's saying the bruises are from playing rough at school. And without more evidence, the system is going to side with her. You know how these things work." Jack flipped through the folder, his anger simmering. "So what? We hand them over and hope for the best." Carla's expression softened slightly. "Jack, I know you care about these kids, but if we don't follow protocol, the entire case could fall apart. You know that." Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "What do we do in the meantime?" "We've got a temporary placement lined up," Carla said. "A group home. It's not perfect, but it's better than sending them back right away." Jack hated the idea. He'd seen too many cases where temporary turned into months, even years, of instability for kids who had already suffered enough. But he also knew Carla was right. If they didn't follow the rules, they risked losing everything. Back in the interview room, Mia and Marcus were sitting in silence, their heads bowed. Jack hesitated in the doorway, his heart heavy. He hated what he had to say next. "Listen," he began, his voice softer than usual. "For tonight, we're going to take you somewhere safe. It's not your home, but it's a place where you'll have food, beds, and people to look after you." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "But we want to stay with you." Jack knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know, buddy, but this is just for now. I promise I'll keep checking on you. I'm not going anywhere." Mia didn't look at him. Her jaw was set, her gaze fixed on the floor. Jack could tell she didn't believe him. And honestly, he couldn't blame her. As he walked them to the car, Jack's mind raced. The system wasn't going to save these kids. If he wanted to keep them safe, he'd have to find another way, one that didn't rely on paperwork and protocols. The group home loomed ahead, a squat building with peeling paint and a chain-link fence. Jack clenched his fists as he watched the twins disappear inside, their small frames swallowed by the building's shadow. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to fix this. For Mia and Marcus, he had to. Unseen threads. The faint hum of the patrol car engine filled the silence as Jack drove through the quiet streets of Ridgewood. The image of the twins disappearing into the group home still lingered in his mind. Marcus's tear-streaked face and Mia's defiant, distrustful glare had carved themselves into his memory. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, as he mulled over the impossibility of the situation. How could he protect them when every step forward felt like sinking deeper into quicksand? Jack pulled into his driveway, the small weathered house standing stark against the dim glow of the streetlights. It wasn't much, but it was home. Tonight, though, it felt emptier than usual. He grabbed the files Carla had handed him earlier and headed inside, his mind already working through the puzzle. The kitchen table was soon covered in papers, reports, and photos. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down, staring at the chaos spread before him. The stepfather's record painted a picture of a man who thrived on control and intimidation. Assault charges dropped, complaints dismissed, and a laundry list of violent incidents, all swept under the rug by a system that had failed too many times. He flipped through the photos of Mia and Marcus, taken during their initial intake at the group home. The bruises on Mia's arms and the hollow look in Marcus's eyes told a story that words couldn't capture. Jack leaned back, rubbing his temples. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Jack frowned. glancing at the clock. It was well past midnight. He reached for his firearm out of habit and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called out. "It's me." Carla's voice came through, muffled but unmistakable. Jack opened the door, surprised to see her standing there with a thick folder tucked under her arm. Her expression was serious, the kind she wore when she was on to something big. "Couldn't wait till morning?" Jack asked, stepping aside to let her in. Carla shook her head, setting the folder on the table and flipping it open. "I've been digging into the stepfather's connections," she said, her tone low. "This guy isn't just your average abusive drunk. He's tied to the Southside Kings." Jack's eyebrows shot up. "The gang?" Carla nodded. "He's not a big player, but he's useful to them. Intimidation, low-level enforcement, stuff like that. He's got enough pull to call in favors, which explains why all his charges keep disappearing." Jack exhaled sharply, leaning over the table to look at the documents Carla had laid out. There were names, mugshots, and a web of connections that pointed to a much larger problem than he'd anticipated. The Southside Kings were notorious for their ruthlessness, and if the stepfather was involved with them, Mia and Marcus were in even greater danger than he'd thought. "This changes everything," Jack said, his voice grim. "If he's got gang ties, he won't stop. He'll come after those kids, no matter where we place them." "That's not all," Carla said, flipping to another page. "I also found something interesting about their mother. She's not as complicit as we thought." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" Carla pointed to a series of hospital records. "Look at these. Multiple visits for accidents. The injuries don't add up, and they coincide with domestic disturbance calls. She's a victim too, Jack. She's not protecting him. She's trapped." Jack sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just a case of child abuse anymore. It was a tangled web of fear, control, and systemic failure. And now he was right in the middle of it. "What's our next move?" Jack asked. Carla hesitated. "We need more evidence, something concrete that ties him to the gang and proves the abuse. Otherwise, the courts will just send those kids back." Jack nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "Then we get it." The next morning, Jack parked his car a block away from the group home. He wasn't supposed to be here. His suspension was still in effect. But he couldn't stay away. He needed to see the twins, to make sure they were okay. The group home was a drab, uninviting building surrounded by a chain-link fence. Jack approached the front desk, his badge clipped to his belt, and asked to speak with the twins. The staff member hesitated but eventually agreed, leading him to a small visitation room. Marcus was the first to enter, his small frame hesitant but hopeful. He lit up when he saw Jack, running to him and wrapping his arms around Jack's waist. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice muffled against Jack's shirt. Jack crouched down, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I told you I wouldn't give up on you." Mia entered next, her posture stiff and her expression guarded. She crossed her arms, leaning against the wall, as she eyed Jack with suspicion. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I wanted to check on you," Jack said honestly. "I know this isn't easy." Mia scoffed. "Easy? You think this is hard. You haven't seen hard." Jack didn't rise to her bait. Instead, he said, "I'm working on getting you out of here. Both of you." Mia's eyes narrowed. "Don't make promises you can't keep." "I don't make promises lightly," Jack replied, meeting her gaze. "I'm going to make sure you're safe, no matter what it takes." For a moment, Mia's tough exterior faltered, and Jack caught a glimpse of the scared, vulnerable child beneath. But just as quickly, she put her walls back up. "You'd better mean that," she said softly, almost to herself. As Jack left the group home, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Carla. "Jack, we've got a lead," she said, her voice urgent. "There's a warehouse on the outskirts of town, one of the Southside Kings' hangouts. We think the stepfather's been meeting his contacts there." "I'm on it," Jack said, already heading to his car. "Jack, wait," Carla warned. "You're suspended. If you get caught." "I'll handle it," Jack cut her off. "Those kids don't have time for me to sit around waiting." As he drove toward the warehouse, Jack's mind raced. The stakes were higher now, and the risks greater, but he didn't care. Maya and Marcus deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt, and Jack was determined to rewrite their story, no matter what it took. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior blending into the industrial district. Jack parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, his senses sharp. He didn't know what he'd find inside, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving without something that could take the stepfather down for good. The web tightens. Jack crouched behind a stack of abandoned pallets, his heart pounding as he surveyed the warehouse. The building was in disrepair, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust and graffiti. A faint light glowed through broken windows, casting eerie shadows across the gravel lot. Voices echoed faintly from within, accompanied by the occasional clatter of metal or a burst of laughter. He pulled his phone from his pocket, flipping it to silent as he texted Carla. "Jack, at the warehouse. Lights on. People inside." Proceeding carefully. A moment later, Carla's reply came through. "Carla, be smart. Don't get yourself killed." Jack smirked despite himself, pocketing the phone as he drew his firearm. He wasn't supposed to be here, but the clock was ticking. If this place held evidence of the stepfather's connection to the Southside Kings, he had to find it. He couldn't let Mia and Marcus slip back into that nightmare. Quietly, Jack moved toward the side of the building, sticking to the shadows. He found a broken window low to the ground, the jagged glass edges glinting in the faint light. Peering inside, he saw a group of men clustered around a table in the center of the room. Crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly against the walls, and the faint smell of gasoline wafted through the air. At the head of the table sat a man Jack recognized instantly, the twins' stepfather. His greasy hair and smug expression made Jack's stomach churn. He was talking animatedly, gesturing with a cigarette as he leaned back in his chair. Jack strained to hear the conversation. "Shipment comes in next week," the stepfather was saying. "We'll move it through the south dock, like last time. Clean and easy." One of the men, a stocky figure with tattoos covering his arms, frowned. "Cops have been sniffing around. You sure it's clean?" The stepfather chuckled darkly. "I've got people on the inside. They won't touch us." Jack's hand tightened around his gun. Inside people. That explained how this man kept slipping through the cracks. The conversation shifted as another man placed a stack of cash on the table. Payment for the last job. Good work keeping that nosy neighbor quiet. Jack's jaw tightened. These weren't just petty criminals. They were organized, dangerous, and deeply embedded in the town's underbelly. He needed to get evidence, and fast. He reached for his phone again, angling it through the broken window to record the scene. The camera captured the faces of the men, the stack of money, and the weapons casually laid out on the table. Jack's heart raced as he zoomed in on the stepfather, who was now laughing loudly. "This town's mine," the man bragged, exhaling a puff of smoke. "Nobody's taking it from me. Not some brat kids, not their deadbeat dad, and definitely not the cops." Jack felt a surge of anger but forced himself to stay calm. He had what he needed, proof of the stepfather's criminal ties and his threats against the twins. Slowly, he began to retreat, careful not to make a sound. But as he moved, his foot caught on a loose piece of metal, sending it clattering across the gravel. Jack froze, his breath catching as the noise echoed through the still night. Inside the warehouse, the voices stopped. "Did you hear that?" one of the men asked sharply. Jack ducked behind the pallets, his heart pounding. He heard footsteps approaching the window, the crunch of boots on gravel. He tightened his grip on his gun, ready for a confrontation. The figure leaned out the window, scanning the area. Jack held his breath, his body pressed against the cold metal of the pallets. After a tense moment, The man muttered something and retreated back inside. Jack exhaled slowly, waiting until the voices resumed before slipping away. He moved quickly and quietly, his mind racing. He had enough to implicate the stepfather and his gang connections. Now he just had to get it to Carla. And fast. When Jack arrived at Carla's house, she was already waiting, her face pale with worry. "Did you find anything?" she asked as he stepped inside, locking the door behind him. Jack handed her the phone, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. "Everything. Video, audio, faces, and names. They're planning a shipment next week." The stepfather's in deep. Carla watched the footage, her expression growing grimmer by the second. "This is bad," she said finally. "Really bad. But it's enough. We can take this to the DA, get a warrant, and shut them down." Jack nodded, exhaustion washing over him. "What about the twins? Can we get them out of the group home?" "With this?" Carla said, gesturing to the phone. "We'll do more than that. We'll make sure they never go back to him." Later that night, Jack sat alone in his kitchen, the house eerily quiet. The events of the day played over in his mind. Mia's angry words, Marcus's tearful goodbye, the danger of the warehouse. He stared at the phone on the table, its screen dark, but holding the key to everything. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but he finally had the tools to win it. For Mia and Marcus, for their safety, for their future, he'd see this through to the end. He picked up his badge, running his thumb over its smooth surface. "Hang in there, kids," he whispered. "I'm not done yet." A fragile alliance. The morning air was heavy with tension as Jack stepped into the DA's office, his jaw tight and his determination unwavering. The sleek, sterile environment was a sharp contrast to the chaos of the warehouse the night before. Jack carried a black duffel bag containing copies of the evidence he'd gathered, his ticket to breaking open the case against the stepfather and his criminal associates. The assistant district attorney, Miranda Lacey, sat behind her desk, her sharp eyes scrutinizing him as he laid out the evidence. She was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and her record of taking down some of the most dangerous criminals in the county. But Jack knew her reputation came with a catch. She played by the book, and any deviation could turn her against him. "Officer Harding," Miranda began, lacing her fingers together, "I'm aware you're currently suspended. Yet here you are, presenting me with evidence obtained outside protocol. Care to explain?" Jack inhaled deeply, meeting her gaze without flinching. "This case is bigger than a suspension. The stepfather of two vulnerable kids is directly connected to the Southside Kings. He's not just abusing them, he's putting their lives in danger." Miranda raised an eyebrow as she flipped through the photographs and documents Jack had laid out. "This is substantial," she admitted, her voice measured. "But it's also risky. If any of this was obtained unlawfully, the defense will rip it apart." "It wasn't," Jack said firmly. "The surveillance video and audio recordings are from a public location. I documented everything by the book." Miranda regarded him for a moment before nodding. "If this holds up, we have enough to take action. I'll file for a warrant immediately." Relief washed over Jack, but it was short-lived. "There's one more thing," he said. "The twins, Mia and Marcus. They're in a group home right now, but their stepfather's reach is long. I'm worried he'll retaliate." Miranda's expression softened slightly. "I'll push for an emergency hearing to remove his parental rights. In the meantime, the group home is secure, and will increase patrols around the area." Jack nodded, though the idea of the twins staying in that place didn't sit well with him. "Thank you," he said quietly. As Jack left the office, his phone buzzed with a message from Carla. "Carla, got more intel on the mother. We need to talk." Jack's pulse quickened. He hurried to his car and drove to the station, his thoughts racing. If Carla had uncovered something new, it could be the missing piece they needed to solidify the case. When Jack entered the station, Carla was waiting in the break room, a file spread open on the table. She motioned for him to sit, her face grim. "What do you have?" Jack asked, lowering himself into the chair. "It's about the mother," Carla began, sliding the file toward him. "Her financial records tell a story she's been hiding." Jack scanned the documents, his brow furrowing as he pieced together the timeline. "Large withdrawals," he muttered, pointing to a series of transactions. "Cash payments. What are these for?" "Extortion," Carla said. "The stepfather's been using her as a pawn, threatening her, controlling her finances. She's been paying off the Southside Kings to keep them from coming after her and the kids." Jack's stomach twisted. "So she's as much a victim as the kids?" Carla nodded. "Exactly. She's not protecting him because she wants to. She's doing it because she's terrified. But here's the kicker." She tapped a page in the file. "She's been trying to gather evidence against him. Look at these notes." Jack read the handwritten entries, his heart sinking. The mother had been keeping a secret log of the stepfather's activities. Dates, times, names of associates. But she hadn't gone to the police, likely out of fear. "This changes everything," Jack said. "If we can get her to testify." "She won't," Carla interrupted. "At least, not yet. She's too scared. But if we can offer her protection, she might reconsider." Jack leaned back, rubbing his temples. The web of threats, fear, and abuse was more intricate than he'd imagined. "So what's the plan?" he asked. "We need to bring her in," Carla said. "Convince her to cooperate. But we'll have to be careful. If the stepfather or the gang catch wind of this, they'll retaliate." Jack nodded. "Then let's do it." Later that evening, Jack and Carla drove to the mother's last known address. The house was small and unassuming, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Jack could feel the tension in the air as they approached the front door. Carla knocked firmly, her hand resting on the holster of her sidearm. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a tired-looking woman with hollow eyes. She froze when she saw them, her grip tightening on the edge of the door. "Mrs. Turner," Carla said gently, "we're here to help." The woman's eyes darted nervously behind them, scanning the street. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "He'll know." Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We know what's been happening. You don't have to face this alone anymore. Let us help you." Tears welled in her eyes as she hesitated, glancing back into the dimly lit house. Finally, she stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Jack and Carla followed her into the living room, where the curtains were drawn tightly shut. "I tried to protect them," she said, her voice trembling. "I tried, but he's too powerful." "You've been brave," Carla said, her tone gentle. "But now it's time to end this. We have enough evidence to take him down, but your testimony could make all the difference." Mrs. Turner shook her head. "He'll kill me. Or worse, he'll come after Mia and Marcus." "We can protect you," Jack said. "We can protect all of you. But we need your help to do it." For a long moment, she said nothing, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "Okay." Back at the station, Jack and Carla worked late into the night, preparing the case. The mother's testimony, combined with the evidence from the warehouse, was enough to issue warrants for multiple members of the Southside Kings, including the stepfather. As dawn broke, Jack stepped outside, his exhaustion tempered by a sense of hope. For the first time, it felt like they were winning. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The stepfather wouldn't go down without a fight, and the gang would do everything in their power to protect their own. Jack glanced at the sunrise, the sky streaked with orange and pink. "Hang in there, kids," he murmured. "We're almost there." Breaking the chains. The sky above Ridgewood was painted a dull gray as Jack tightened his vest and checked his gear. The morning air was heavy with humidity, and every breath felt like a reminder of the weight of the day ahead. Across from him, Carla adjusted her earpiece, her face set with grim determination. Behind them, a convoy of patrol cars and unmarked vehicles waited, engines idling softly. This was it, the operation that could bring the stepfather and the Southside Kings crashing down. Everyone clear on the plan? Carla asked, addressing the gathered officers. Her voice was sharp and authoritative, cutting through the tension like a blade. A chorus of affirmations followed. Jack scanned the team, his gut twisting with anxiety. He knew the risks. The warehouse was heavily tied to the gang, and this operation wasn't just about bringing down one man. It was about dismantling a network of crime and fear. Jack turned to Carla. Are the kids safe? She nodded. The group home is on lockdown, and Mrs. Turner is in protective custody. We've covered our bases. It wasn't enough to ease his mind, but Jack nodded anyway. His focus shifted back to the task at hand. Let's move. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a monolithic reminder of Ridgewood's forgotten industrial past. The convoy stopped a block away, and the officers disembarked quietly, spreading out in coordinated groups. Jack and Carla led the main team, their footsteps muffled on the gravel as they approached the building. The plan was straightforward but high risk. Secure the perimeter, breach the warehouse, and apprehend everyone inside. Jack's heart pounded as he neared the side entrance, his weapon drawn and ready. The memory of the stepfather's smug face fueled his determination. Carla gave the signal, and the team moved into position. The battering ram slammed into the door with a deafening crack, and chaos erupted. Officers poured into the warehouse, their shouts mixing with the startled cries of the gang members inside. Jack's adrenaline surged as he cleared the first room, his eyes scanning for threats. He spotted two men bolting toward the back exit and gave chase. Freeze. Police. One of the men turned, pulling a weapon, but Jack was faster. He fired a single shot, aiming for the man's shoulder. The gun clattered to the ground as the suspect crumpled, clutching his arm. The second man dropped to his knees, his hands raised in surrender. Clear, Jack shouted, handcuffing the suspect as Carla moved in to secure the area. The central room of the warehouse was a frenzy of activity. Crates were overturned, money and weapons scattered across the floor. The stepfather stood in the middle of it all, his face twisted with rage. He grabbed a crowbar, swinging it wildly as officers closed in. "Stay back," he bellowed, his voice desperate. Jack stepped forward, his gun trained on the man. "It's over. Drop the weapon." The stepfather's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. But the gang members he'd relied on were either subdued or fleeing. His bravado cracked, and he hurled the crowbar to the ground, raising his hands in defeat. "You're making a mistake," he sneered as officers moved in to cuff him. "You think this is going to change anything? You don't know who you're messing with." Jack didn't reply. He watched as the stepfather was hauled away, the weight on his chest easing slightly. But he knew this was only part of the battle. The gang would retaliate, and the system wasn't always kind to victims like Mia, Marcus, and their mother. Back at the station, the atmosphere was tense but charged with a sense of accomplishment. The operation had been a success. Several arrests, significant evidence seized, and the stepfather finally in custody. Yet Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. He sat in the conference room with Carla, reviewing the evidence they'd collected. Photos, financial records, and Mrs. Turner's testimony painted a damning picture of the stepfather's activities. But it was Mia and Marcus who lingered in Jack's mind. "They're going to need more than this," Jack said, his voice heavy. "The system will chew them up and spit them out if we don't keep pushing." Carla leaned back in her chair, exhaustion evident in her posture. "I know, but this is a start. We've given them a chance, Jack. That's more than most people get." Jack nodded, though the knot in his stomach remained. He thought of Mia's defiance, her unwillingness to trust anyone, and Marcus's quiet hope that someone would finally keep their promises. The next day, Jack visited the group home. The security guards let him in without question, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. Jack found Mia and Marcus in the common room, sitting at a small table with a puzzle between them. Marcus's face lit up when he saw Jack. "You came back." Jack crouched beside him, offering a small smile. "Told you I would." Mia's gaze was wary, her hands stilling as they hovered over a puzzle piece. "What do you want?" "I wanted to tell you in person," Jack said. "Your stepfather's in custody. He can't hurt you anymore." Mia's expression didn't change, but her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. "What about Mom?" she asked, her voice sharp. "She's safe," Jack assured her. "She's been helping us build a case against him." Mia's lips pressed into a thin line. "She let it happen." Jack hesitated. "She made mistakes, but she's trying to make things right now. She wants to protect you." Mia looked away, her jaw tightening. Marcus, meanwhile, reached for Jack's hand. "Does that mean we can come with you now?" Jack's heart ached at the question. "Not yet, buddy. But we're working on it. You're not alone anymore, I promise." Mia's eyes flicked back to him, her expression unreadable. "Promises don't mean much," she said quietly. "I know," Jack replied. "But I'm not giving up on you. Not now, not ever." For a moment, the tension hung heavy in the air. Then Mia picked up a puzzle piece and placed it on the table. "We'll see," she said, her voice softer than before. Jack stayed with them for a while, helping Marcus with the puzzle and offering Mia quiet support. As he left, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. The chains holding them down were beginning to break, and he was determined to see them free. The road to freedom. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet tension as Jack adjusted his tie, his eyes scanning the rows of spectators. On one side sat Carla and a few other officers who had worked on the case. On the other, members of the Southside Kings lingered at the back, their faces impassive but their presence a clear message. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war over control, fear, and survival. At the front of the courtroom, the twin stepfather sat in a pristine suit, a mocking smirk plastered across his face. His defense attorney, a sharp-looking man with an air of arrogance, leaned close, whispering something that made him laugh softly. Jack clenched his fists at the sight. In the row behind Jack, Mia and Marcus sat with their mother. Marcus looked small and nervous, his wide eyes darting around the room, while Mia sat rigidly, her face set in a mask of indifference. Their mother, pale and visibly exhausted, held Marcus's hand tightly, as though it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Jack turned to Carla, who sat beside him with a file in her lap. "Do you think we got enough?" he asked, his voice low. Carla nodded, though her expression was cautious. "The evidence is solid. The stepfather's gang ties, the testimony from his associates, Mrs. Turner's statement. It all paints a damning picture. But his lawyer is good. He's going to throw everything he has at this." The bailiff called for order as the judge entered, a stern-faced woman whose reputation for fairness preceded her. She settled into her seat, her gavel striking sharply against the wood. "Let's proceed," she said. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, presenting the evidence Jack and Carla had worked so hard to gather. Photos of the warehouse, recordings of the stepfather's threats, financial records linking him to the gang. It was all there. Mrs. Turner's testimony was particularly powerful, her voice trembling as she recounted years of abuse and manipulation. "I was afraid," she said, her hand shaking as she clutched the witness stand. "Afraid for my life and for my children's lives. He controlled everything. Our money, our movements. He made it clear that if I tried to leave, we'd pay the price." Jack watched Mia as her mother spoke. The girl's expression remained stoic, but her hands were clenched into fists in her lap. Marcus leaned into his sister, seeking comfort in her quiet strength. When it was the defense's turn, the stepfather's lawyer went on the attack, attempting to discredit Mrs. Turner and cast doubt on the evidence. "She's a scorned woman," the lawyer argued, pacing in front of the jury. "Her story is full of holes, and her motives are clear. This is a vendetta, not a quest for justice." Jack's jaw tightened as the lawyer spoke, twisting the truth into something unrecognizable. But he reminded himself that the facts were on their side. They just needed the jury to see them. The trial dragged on for hours, every word and piece of evidence scrutinized. By the time the closing arguments were made, the weight of the day had settled heavily on everyone in the room. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Jack stayed close to Mia and Marcus, offering quiet reassurances while Carla worked to keep Mrs. Turner calm. When the jury finally returned, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper. On the charges of child abuse, domestic violence, and conspiracy with a criminal organization, we find the defendant guilty. A collective breath seemed to release from the room. Marcus clung to his mother, tears streaming down his face, while Maya remained still, her expression unreadable. Jack felt a wave of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one step in a long journey. The stepfather's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of fury as the judge handed down the sentence. 20 years without the possibility of parole. The gang members in the back exchanged dark looks before filing out silently, their presence still a looming threat. The days that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and planning. With the stepfather out of the picture, the focus shifted to ensuring Mia and Marcus's long-term safety and stability. Their mother had agreed to enter a rehabilitation program, recognizing the damage her fear and inaction had caused. Jack visited the twins often, staying involved in their lives as much as he could. The bond he'd formed with them had grown stronger, especially with Marcus, who had come to see Jack as a protector and friend. Mia, ever guarded, remained distant, though Jack could see glimpses of trust beginning to form. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch of his home, he heard a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Mia standing there, her arms crossed and her expression uncertain. "Can I talk to you?" she asked quietly. Jack stepped aside, letting her in. She sat on the couch, her posture stiff, and stared at the floor for a long moment before speaking. "I wanted to say, thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for not giving up on us." Jack felt a lump in his throat, but managed a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what I had to." Mia looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "A lot of people say that, but you're the only one who meant it." Jack reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You and Marcus deserve to be safe, to have a chance at a better life. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Mia nodded, her defenses lowering just a little. "We're going to try," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "to start over. But it's scary." "It's okay to be scared," Jack said. "Starting over is hard, but it's worth it. And you're not alone." As Mia left that evening, Jack felt a deep sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but they'd won an important battle. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright, not just for Mia and Marcus, but for Jack as well. A new dawn. The weeks that followed the trial brought a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. Jack worked closely with Carla, Child Services, and the district attorney to ensure that the twins and their mother could rebuild their lives. While the stepfather was behind bars, the specter of the Southside Kings still loomed, and everyone involved knew the gang wouldn't forget what had happened. Jack spent many evenings at the group home, checking on Mia and Marcus. Slowly, the walls Mia had built around herself began to crack. She still didn't fully trust the world, but she started trusting Jack, a little more with each visit. One evening, as Jack walked into the group home, he found Marcus sprawled on the floor with a sketchbook, a small set of crayons beside him. He was deeply engrossed in a drawing, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Hey, buddy," Jack said, crouching down beside him. "What are you working on?" Marcus looked up with a bright smile. "It's you, Mia, and me," he said, holding up the paper. The drawing was a colorful, childlike depiction of 3 stick figures standing in front of a small house. Above them, a smiling sun beamed down. Jack chuckled, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and sadness. "That's amazing, Marcus. You've got some serious talent." Marcus beamed. "Mia said I should draw something happy." Jack glanced at Mia, who sat nearby with a book in her lap. She didn't look up, but there was a small, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. Jack's heart swelled. This was what he'd fought for. Moments like this. A month later, Jack stood on the steps of the family court, watching as Mrs. Turner signed the final custody paperwork. She completed her rehabilitation program, and the court had granted her full custody of Mia and Marcus. With the stepfather gone, and under the close supervision of social services, the family had a chance to start fresh. Mrs. Turner approached Jack, her face soft with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You didn't just save my kids. You saved me." Jack nodded, his voice steady but kind. "You're the one who saved them by stepping up. Don't forget that." Mia and Marcus stood nearby, their small hands clutching their mothers. Marcus waved at Jack, his face lighting up. Mia hesitated, her expression torn. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, she stepped forward and hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jack hugged her back gently, his throat tight. "You're welcome, kiddo. You're going to be okay. Both of you." Mia pulled back, her eyes glistening but resolute. "You promise?" Jack met her gaze, his voice unwavering. "I promise." The family moved to a new town a week later, far from the Southside Kings and the shadows of Ridgewood. Jack stayed in touch, exchanging letters with Marcus and hearing about their progress through updates from Carla. Maya wrote him once, a short, scribbled note that said, "Thank you for keeping your promise." Months passed, and Ridgewood slowly began to heal. The Southside Kings faced a significant blow after the operation, and several key members were taken down in subsequent arrests. Jack, reinstated to full duty, continued to patrol the streets, his sense of purpose renewed. One evening, as he drove through the neighborhood, Jack spotted a familiar figure sitting on the curb. Marcus. Jack pulled over, his heart skipping a beat, but before he could worry, Marcus turned and waved, smiling broadly. "We came back to visit," Marcus explained as Jack stepped out of the car. "Mom said it's okay now." Jack's eyes softened as he noticed Mia and Mrs. Turner standing nearby, their expressions warm and content. The change in them was profound. Mia's shoulders were no longer tense, and Mrs. Turner's eyes no longer held that haunted look. Mia approached Jack, her arms crossed but her smile genuine. "We're doing okay," she said simply. "Better than okay, actually." Jack nodded, a deep sense of pride filling him. "I knew you would be." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack stood with the family he'd fought so hard to protect. They weren't the same frightened, broken people he'd met months ago. They were stronger, braver, and finally free. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt free too.